back to Psychedelics. Today, Kyle and I have a very exciting guest. Not sure how it took us this long to hook up with you, Jeremy, but really happy to have Jeremy Narby here, famed anthropologist, author of Cosmic Serpent. And what's the name of the new book?
Plant Teachers, Ayahuasca, Tobacco, and the Pursuit of Knowledge.
Outstanding. Yeah, before we recorded, we had a lot of really fun conversation, and I'm quite excited to dig in. Perhaps a great question first is, what came first, anthropology or psychedelics?
Psychedelics, in fact. And I was studying history at the University of Canterbury in England, and I was interested in the history of mental illness. And it turns out that we had to do an internship, or we could do some form of to write this long paper. We could spend the summer doing something related to it. And a friend of my father knew Humphrey Osmond, the British psychiatrist who coined the word psychedelic in his correspondence with Aldous Huxley in the 1950s. And Humphrey Osmond was running the psychiatric hospital in Tuscaloosa in Alabama in 1980. And through this connection, I spent a month in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, living with Humphrey Osmond and his wife and their son, who was my age at that point, 18 or 19. And well, Humphrey was a living legend. I mean, he coined the word psychedelic. And he liked being, he was already like the mad professor with gray hair and almost retiring at this point. And he was happy to have a young university student from Europe whom he could instruct. And in the evenings, we'd just sit in his reading room and library, and we'd talk for an hour, and he'd say, "Oh, well, Stan Groff, blah blah blah," or "Oh, Timothy Leary, blah," blah. And then he'd tell the whole story. He certainly had a gift for gab, and then he'd pull out these piles of books. And so he essentially, it's not that I plunged into the literature. He threw me into the deep end of the literature of psychedelics, LSD, how they were using it in the 50s in Saskatchewan to cure alcoholics. I mean, the whole story. And the story that there was this serious therapeutic way of approaching it. And then there was the other Timothy Leary, let's put it in the drinking water and have millions of people turn on and drop out, etc. approach. Which Humphrey frowned on. And so from the start, I was like formatted in the school that these were serious tools and that one had to treat them seriously as scholars and researchers. And it wasn't just for having a good time or what have you. At this point, LSD was already illegal, largely frowned upon. In 1980, it was hard to get. People weren't taking it anymore. It had fallen out of favor. But still, I live in Switzerland, which is where LSD was first synthesized. And over here in the early 1980s, it was possible to get LSD. So after meeting Humphrey Osmond, I got some LSD, tried it. Then I looked into psychedelic mushrooms that grow over here as well. And so I already had some kind of psychedelic experience when I was around 20, 21, and then decided to study anthropology. And for completely non-psychedelic related reasons, I did political anthropology focusing on indigenous people. And the place to go at that point to look at, for example, a conflict between the World Bank and indigenous people was the Peruvian Amazon, which happens to be the world capital of psychedelic plants. But once again, that's not why I decided to go there. So to do an anthropology that was supposed to be politically engaged and in solidarity with the Ashaninka people, to show how they used the rainforest in a way that allowed them to own their lands because they used the forest productively. At least that was what I wanted to show. Um, then, in the middle of the 1980s, I found myself living with these indigenous Amazonian people, asking them what they knew about the forest, what plants they knew, how they knew what they knew. And once again, I ran into psychedelics right there because these Ashaninka people would say, well, we have ayahuasqueros, tabaqueros. These are people who take these psychoactive plant mixtures and swallow them and have visions. And in their visions, they learn about plant properties and many other things. That's how we know what we know about plants. Well, right then, when I first started hearing this at the age of 25 in 1985, I thought it was a bit of a joke because I was you know, I didn't think that one could take psychedelics and learn about plant properties. I thought one could take LSD and have an interesting time in the woods with one's friends. But if you really started thinking that the trees were talking to you, there was a bit of a problem. That was my point of view at the time. But here were these rainforest Indians living in the most biodiverse place on earth saying, yes, we learn about plant properties by drinking this hallucinogenic vine mixture. Um, that was a kind of a mystery, an intriguing mystery. And actually, it kind of contradicted the main argument I wanted to make with my research, which was to show that these people used their resources rationally and therefore deserved the right to own their lands. The World Bank was saying they don't use their resources rationally, so we can take their lands away and give them to people with a market mentality and call this development. They'll cut down the trees, put on cattle pastures, etc. I mean, this was 30 years ago, 35 years ago. Oh my, it's been a long time. At least the things have changed, but the world hasn't gotten any more simple. But still, there we were. That these Ashaninka people were telling me that the origin of their botanical knowledge was hallucinogenic was something that I thought I'd look into more as a hobby, like on a Friday night, than as part of my dissertation on the rational uses of the rainforest by the Ashaninka. In other words, I already knew I was going to soft pedal the mystical part um, because I was a, Marxist anthropologist wanting to argue in favor of the indigenous people against the World Bank, quite simply. But still, when they said, actually, one time I asked in another village, how do you guys know what you know about plants? This one young fellow said, look, brother Jeremy, if you want to know the answer to that question, you have to drink ayahuasca. And if you like, I'll show you sometime. It's the television of the forest. You can see images and learn things.
What was
So
going through your mind
you
then?
know, actually, I said okay because I was interested and curious, but I didn't actually really take it seriously. He said, "Oh yeah, make sure you don't eat anything at midday, and just be ready in the evening." Actually, at midday, I was hungry. I thought, "Oh man, that's just superstition." I ate a bit of deer meat and some manioc, um, and then I paid the price in the evening. Um, and the whole thing was an extremely eye-opening experience, um, way more than LSD, I should say. And then we could talk about the difference. But and to as a kind of a full disclosure, the young he was 30 years old. He'd been trained by the Shipibo, who's a neighboring tribe. He was a sort of an upcoming ayahuasquero who wanted to show his stuff. Um, and so he chose the visiting gringo anthropologist to show what he could do. And actually, before we even drank the brew, he rolled up some plant material in a notebook paper. He tore a page out of a notebook and rolled up this stuff and passed it round. Uh, who am I not to inhale, right? And he said, "This is Toei." I said, I didn't even know what Toei was. Actually, it's, Datura. Uh, and it's known to facilitate out of body experiences. Well, um, an hour later, that having swallowed the bitter brew, uh, I found myself surrounded by enormous fluorescent serpents who explained to me how insignificantly small I was. I vomited colors. I blasted out of my body and found myself miles above the planet that was covered with ice. Uh, then, when the fellow modified his melody, I landed back in my body and started seeing hundreds of thousands of detailed images, like the veins of a human hand and the veins of a green leaf. This, the whole thing. I mean, it was an overwhelming experience, and it was at the time. This was 1985. The rock videos that they were starting to make at that point were like prehistoric when it came to, like, when 1985 rock videos would do psychedelic imagery. It would be at best cartoonish. This was like complex Fabergé egg-like, detailed, bejeweled, moving stuff that clearly could not come out of my subconscious, whatever that might be. There was stuff in there I'd never seen, never thought about. The overall experience was the next day. I tried to freshen up down by the river, and for example, I took a leaf from a bush and held it up to the sun and looked at the texture of the leaf, and then touched my own hand skin and saw that it was true. That actually, that yes, it feels the same, it looks the same, and that, oh my goodness, I'm like a plant, but except I can walk around, which is almost even better. But still part of this like glistening layer of life around the planet. This was like the first time in my 25-year-old life that I felt reconciled with nature. Um, for an anthropologist, a human who studies humans, focused on humans, for Mr. Focused on Humans, this was like not only just what the doctor ordered, but a major kick in the pants and the antidote to the anthropocentrism of anthropology. Not nothing, in other words, but also way too much. Like, how could I go back to my anthropology department and tell them the facts of the matter, which were that I'd swallowed this bitter vegetal liquid, that it had blown my little Western mind and taught me many important things about my place in the biosphere. Well, maybe I could have, and I don't know, but I chose not to. Um, Ayahuasca actually is mentioned in like a couple of footnotes in the dissertation I went on to write about the Ashaninka uses of the rainforest. And I became a doctor in anthropology.
Did anybody ask you questions about those footnotes?
Nope. This was the 1980s. I mean, I
It
don't
makes
know.
me wonder if they kind of knew a little bit, but like didn't want to go there yet.
Well, look, actually, this is why I think knowing about the past is interesting. Uh, I mean, Carlos Castaneda, does that ring any bells?
Oh yeah,
Totally.
Because like in the anthropology of the 1960s, mainly 1970s, this is, he got kicked out. And okay, he was doing fiction, he was doing amalgamation of different elements, and he was synthesizing things himself. He was a storyteller, but it was based on real knowledge. He's probably one of the better writers on questions of sorcery, that's for sure, and also datura and stuff like that. Um, and perhaps he was what the Western world needed to get jolted off its pedestal and to start taking these things seriously. Perhaps it did take a trickster like Castaneda to get that happening. I mean, it wasn't the staid professors in the anthropology departments at that point who were doing it.
Mm.
You know, so, but the state professors didn't like it at all, and so they disqualified him badly. And I don't know, what is it? The Don Juan papers? Is this like 1973 or 75? I mean, there was some people made a profession of, like, trashing Castaneda and stuff. Um, and then, so in the middle of the 1980s, if you were a young anthropologist, the idea that you would go and start taking the indigenous hallucinogens seriously, I mean, it had "Don't do this" written all over it.
Mm.
Uh,
Interesting. Was there much of a shadow from Schultes at that point
well,
in the
no,
field?
that's a really interesting thing, is that ethnobotanists had a license that anthropologists did not, and I
Mm.
think the answer is fairly um, clear on this one. It is that anthropology spent a good part of the 20th century trying to prove that it was a science,
Right.
and so that it banished,
Sounds
like,
like
first
psychology. Yeah.
as it banished first personness and subjectiveness and so forth. And then it realized in the 1960s, or some of its practitioners realized in the 60s and the 70s, that actually claiming to have an objective gaze on other cultures was actually a colonial enterprise, and that anthropology was the illegitimate daughter of colonialism. Ooh la la! And so that then in the early 1980s, the anthropologists started realizing that the only thing that you could do was give a politically situated position. You say, this is the point of view from which I am observing. This is what I have observed. And then you leave third parties to triangulate and figure it out. But you can't claim to be not there. You can't claim to have a perspective based on an absence of perspective. Um, so all until anthropologists actually embraced their own subjectivity, one could say, which was during the 1980s, and I'm talking intellectually, when they ran into hallucinogens in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. I mean, mainly they didn't try it, or if they did, they didn't talk about it. And
Mm.
and those who did, and then there was like Michael Harner. He tried ayahuasca. He was like one of the first academics to really speak out about his experience, and then start taking shamanism seriously. And the next thing you know, he was disqualified too. I mean, this was there was a kind of a Vatican nature to it, and that's inside anthropology. But but meanwhile, the ethnobotanists like Schultes, I mean, that guy? We criticize colonial people a lot, but that guy was like he was like the good-looking face of colonialism. I mean, he really did
Tip of the
walk.
spear.
Yeah, he'd walk around like the colonial doctor that he was, but he'd actually sleep, live there, drink their stuff, respect them like doctors, not exclude them. He was like a major force in opening up bona fide respect for indigenous Amazonian knowledge.
Mm.
Probably at least as much as the intellectual anthropologists who wouldn't swallow the bruise. Um, so there was that difference, and I think there were certainly individuals like Spruce in the 19th century or Schultes in the 20th century, and they made a huge difference just by themselves, just by doing their career. It's I mean, they became the discipline. So there are cases where individuals have made big differences, and I think ethnobotany is. And then you get guys like Wade Davis who have come along and followed. So, and it's a I think ethnobotany is a very interesting discipline.
Mm. So what made you decide to want to go public with your kind of psychedelic information or explorations in the Amazon?
Well, actually, that's pretty easy. From the start, I've considered that my job, once I got the doctorate, which actually seemed a little bit not of to become a doctor means that you know more. That's what the word doctor means in Latin. And I felt that, okay, I knew a little bit more about Ashaninka reality, but actually in the dissertation that allowed me to become a doctor, I'd actually not spoken about the central parts according to the Ashaninka themselves. So that was kind of weird. And then I was happy to leave the academy and become, in fact, a fundraiser for indigenous Amazonian initiatives. So, indigenous people have the organizations, they want to get their territories demarcated, they want bilingual education for their kids, they want support for different initiatives of theirs for survival, for the rainforest, and so forth. So, I was happy to make myself useful, mainly gathering funds for rainforest land titling, arguing these people know how to use their resources rationally. In other words, they're the only ones who can use the forest productively without destroying it. So if you want to protect the rainforest, give us money so that we can pay for the demarcation, legal land titling of their territory in initiatives that they will be running. People here. So I'd get up and talk 3-4 years. I was actually pretty good at it. I mean, I raised, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And then hundreds of thousands of acres were demarcated. Actually, we've been doing it for 30 years, and now what is it? It's like 6 million hectares. That's like more than 14 million acres. It's, I mean,
incredible.
So, yeah, it works.
What was the name of the organization?
Nouvelle Planète, which means new planet in French. But after about 3 or 4 years of like getting up and slowly showing slides and saying, "Oh, look, these are Amazonian Indians. They really know how to use the rainforest rationally, and they have these gardens where they do polyculture and they only cut down small surfaces, and so they really know how to use the rainforest without destroying it, etc." I started thinking, look, there's something missing here. I'm not telling the full story. I'm once again soft pedaling what the Ashaninka themselves say, which is that they know about the plants and the rainforest because they take these plants that teach them in their visions. So that there was a kind of, I was a little bit, it was at the back of my mind. I also knew that if I started standing up and saying, "Hey, I took ayahuasca and blah blah blah," that it would still be a little bit strange. At this point, early 1990s, people had gone from the cocaine of the 80s to the ecstasy of the 90s. So there was a lot of sort of discotheque, ecstasy swallowing, even low dose LSD swallowing starting to happen. And I was never much of a discotheque or an ecstasy guy, really. But there was an audience, people who started wanting to hear more about psychedelics again, hallucinogens. I mean, talking about ayahuasca in the 1980s, when I got back from the Amazon, people, they would tune out. They didn't like it. It made them feel uneasy. It was like you say the words LSD at a dinner party in 1985, and it just didn't go down. In the 1990s, something changed. And for me, what also changed was I went to the Rio summit in 1992, and suddenly there are all these governments talking about the knowledge of indigenous people, about biodiversity, talking about the knowledge of Amazonian Indians and how we have to recognize it and take it into consideration. Everybody talking about the knowledge of indigenous Amazonians. Nobody talking about the hallucinogenic origin of this knowledge as they themselves discuss it. So then I thought, this is a job for independent anthropology man. So I rushed into the phone booth and put on my suit. And actually, I rushed to talk to my boss at that point, and I'd been raising funds for 4 years, and said, "Boss, I'd like to write a book about the hallucinogenic origin of the ecological knowledge of the indigenous people of the Western Amazon. And he said, take your time.
Mm.
So that was like 1993. And suddenly, 8 years after that ayahuasca experience, 33 years old, with two young children and a fundraising job, I kind of I dove into the literature, but this time the literature of ayahuasca shamanism, which I hadn't really studied it. I'd lived with people who practiced it, but I hadn't read what other anthropologists had written about it. And so that was the beginning of the Cosmic Serpent, realizing that actually most of these indigenous people in the Western Amazon say the same thing that the Ashaninka had said to me, that yes, that's how they learn about plant properties. They take ayahuasca and other teacher plants, and in their visions, they get this knowledge.
Mm.
So there was clearly, actually, just as a political activist, you ask, how did I get into this? This was like, and if you're a dog, suddenly you get, there's a bone right there. There it is. Look, if as a political activist, if so, I advocate in favor of indigenous Amazonian people, and I think that it would be good if the international scientific community could take their knowledge more seriously, take them into consideration when we talk about developing the rainforest, for example, treat them as real interlocutors. Um, well, everybody agrees that they have deep knowledge about the plants in the rainforest, and this is the most biodiverse place on Earth. In fact, there are more names for plants in indigenous languages than in Latin given by scientists. In other words, indigenous Amazonian people know Amazonian plants better than all the ethnobotanists in the world. Um, and yet, we can't even have a conversation with them about how they say they get this knowledge. So we can use their knowledge, we can extract it pharmaceutically, we can patent it, we can write books about it, but we can't have a conversation with them about its origin. Wait a second. Something ain't right. Something ain't right. Clearly, I mean, I knew why nobody could consider the subject. I myself had decided not to consider the subject. It was because it contradicted the premises of our system of knowledge. Claiming that there is verifiable information in your hallucinations is the definition of psychosis. In other words, it couldn't be true. From the rational point of view, it was an epistemological impossibility. That was the thing. But actually, that only made it more interesting, I thought. And that actually, when you run into such contradictions, it's important not to sort of turn away from them. Or actually, if you see everybody else turning away from them, you know that that's where you got to go and scratch. And I think that's what Thomas Kuhn said in his The History of Scientific Paradigms, is that it's when you get to that point of contradiction that's where the change is going to happen, that you go and scratch at that. And it's people who scratch away at the contradiction that make the paradigm shift. At least that's what I thought Thomas Kuhn wrote. So it just seemed pretty straightforward as a political activist and a guy who'd read a little bit of history of science and so on. I thought, look, and if I don't look into this, who is going to look into it? It was like a duty. And I was supposed to be a free-thinking, independent, non-academically affiliated fellow working for a neutral Swiss humanitarian organization, inspired by the philosophy of Albert Schweitzer and the respect of life. So, I mean, once again, if I didn't look into it, I don't know who could do the job. So, that I launched into it with a kind of almost religiously, and I say that as an agnostic. With that, I really believe that this is an important question, even though a lot of people seem to turn away from it. and I'm going to give it the best to sort of give it my best to deal with it. And if that means looking like a crazy guy who takes his hallucinations seriously, then I'll go out on that limb. And actually, I'll be in pretty good company. In other words, all the shamans in the world, for example. Um, but so that's how it came about.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, and yeah, thanks for your courage to really dive into that. And it's important. I think this brings up some of the topics that we were discussing a little bit earlier about ways of knowing, and how different ways of knowing could be valid, right? So we're talking about the indigenous perspective versus kind of like the scientific way of knowing, and you kind of touched on that in your new book. And I wonder if you could, just speak on that a little bit more.
Yeah, for sure. Um, Well, I think it's a key subject. The first thing is that anybody who speaks from a particular way of knowing, and I think it's important to be as clear as possible. Um, I was brought up in the rational way of knowing, and I continue to subscribe to. I think that there's something quite beautiful in rational science, which is basic verifiability. In other words, what you propose, you don't propose things that people have to believe. You propose things that can be verified by other people independently. Um, and so, yeah, and that's actually what I think rationalism can bring to shamanism. It's one of the things that is rough in the practice of indigenous Amazonian shamanism is that the practitioners among them tend to fight a lot, and so the context to calmly verify is often not there. Um, but I'm kind of getting ahead of myself right here. Um, when it's up until now, the scientific view of, let's say, shamanism or Amazonian shamanism has not been very favorable. I mean, historically, uh, uh, the first anthropologists defined shamans as schizophrenics, for example, and it's only been in recent decades that anthropologists have started to recognize that shamans have certain kinds of knowledge about the world, and even verifiable knowledge. And that's one of the interesting things about Amazonian um, approaches to knowledge is that often people will tell you, um, well, yes, we take this plant and then it does this and then it does that, and you can try it. In other words, you can verify it. And actually, my experience with ayahuasca certainly verified what the Ashaninka told me. You drink this and you see images and you learn things. It's the television of the forest. Oh, I see. I drank it. I saw images, and I learned things. Yeah, yes, sir. Well, it's true. It's a subjective screen, and proving one's hallucinations is difficult, and reproducing one's hallucinations is difficult, and getting someone else to see one's hallucinations is difficult. So actually, the that form of getting knowledge does not lend itself to scientific verification. And I think it's interesting to be clear about that kind of difference, and to work with it. It's like when you have and this is something that I think people run into confusions on this level, is like when you see images in an ayahuasca experience. Um, I think that these images, it's important not to confuse them with ultimate reality or what you have to do, and to see them. I mean, some may be that. Sometimes you may see ultimate reality. I mean, I'm not here to say that you can never see ultimate reality, but often it can be like extremely enhanced imagination or possible scenario, or something that is not to be confused with what is really out there now or what really will be out there in 2 days' time. It's a possibility that is made very visual at that moment in your mind. Then maybe you can download that idea. maybe it's in a different realm, but actually we live in this realm. We're right here on the surface of this planet, and that maybe that notion or idea or vision can eventually, by your own work, be brought down here. But just like you can imagine something and then turn it into reality, I mean, imagination is a very beautiful thing, and I think that ayahuasca certainly enhances imagination, and that the ayahuasca enhanced human mind is capable of enormous creativity. But it's important to be clear about what is true, what can be verified, what actually operates here and now, and what is more in the realm of possibility. And I don't have all the answers on how to tell the difference. My co-author, Rafael Chanchari, I actually put the question to him about.
Yeah, you had some really interesting conversations with him about that, and talking about ayahuasca as truth. But yeah, you're tossing out, well, what happens when somebody has these crazy downloads and does crazy stuff? How do you differentiate between truth and, whatever else is going on there? I thought that was really interesting and a really important conversation to have, right? I think a lot of people take a lot of the visions or their experience as truth. And, something that we often talk about is how do we discern that information? And
well,
how do we work
Raphael, who's a clever old fox, said that ultimately it's a question of experience. And so coming from him, he's been at it for 35 years. And it's just like, so he says, what I can say about it is that when you do it often enough, then you can tell the difference. And so it's just something that you develop with time. So you just have to do it often enough. In other words, for the first 30 years, don't trust yourself. And so that and it takes about 30 years to get to the point of practice where you can know that you're either projecting or that you're getting some clear information. Where I say he's a clever fox is that it kind of disqualifies everybody except himself, in other words, there are very few people out there who have 30 years of experience working on that specific question. So it's actually a discreet way of saying, don't trust yourself too much. Don't take your own visions too seriously. Treat them as, at best, possibly pertinent.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. It's a funny twist because we often see overuse and have to comment on overuse in the current day, and it never comes up that it's overuse over an arc of 20 or 30 years. And to even get 30 years in, I think you have to have an appropriate level of use, not really overuse. Otherwise, you're probably going to get locked up or something or have some real problems. But yeah.
Well, I'd be happy just to comment a little bit on overuse.
Please.
In my case, after a mind-boggling ayahuasca experience and then a couple of other small ones that never really led to much, I didn't do ayahuasca for 8 years or even 10. In fact, I didn't do it for 8 years. Then I wrote a book for 2 years, and only when the book was over did I go back and drink some ayahuasca. I'm not saying that everybody has to do it that way. Just that single experience gave me enough to think about and to grapple with for all that time. Then returning to it in 1995, I've probably done it a couple of times a year, every year since then. So what's that? 50 times since then. Sometimes I won't do it for 2 years, and then I may do 3 sessions in 10 days. And then the point is that I think 1 or 2 sessions a year is enough to give you a lot of stuff to work on. And I also think that having a foot in the, let's just say, the Western world, I don't know, the industrial world, the Monday to Friday world, that to drinking ayahuasca too often makes it hard to stay in that world. So, and this is not advice. It's just like when so I've been doing this at that rhythm, and then I see people who are like doing ayahuasca every weekend or something, or a couple times a week or whatever, and it's like, well, okay, you can do that, but and it's true that certain practicing Amazonian shamans do that, but that's their profession. But here we're talking
Right.
about Western people who drive cars, have part-time jobs or whatever, and they're drinking ayahuasca all the time. And it's like, I don't know. Um, is it overuse? You know, people can do what they want, but to me, it seems like when you have this thing that is so powerful and that can give you so much to work on for a year, what's the point of doing it twice a week? But I mean, you know, maybe somebody would like to contradict me and tell me, say why it's so wonderful to drink it all the time. I haven't really seen anybody, you know, the people that I see really getting into very regular ayahuasca drinking, it often gets complicated. And, you know, there are power games and, oh, yeah, yeah,
Mm.
it's like, um, that's the thing is that you think, it's this wonderful Amazonian shamanic thing. It's the rainforest and it's a source of knowledge and so forth. But it's actually a very powerful hallucinogen, psychedelic agent, or whatever you want to call it. And if you're taking it all the time, it's going to be rough, even if it
I was
is a
chatting
plant.
with some. Yeah, I was chatting with somebody who spent time. I forget where it was, either in Brazil or Peru, and they were saying that the people that they studied with, they would only drink it when they really need it. And they had this and I asked, well, why is that? Thinking kind of so different how maybe Westerns approach it at times. And she was saying that, you know, every time the shaman or the person in the tribe would go into that realm, it was like it had ripple effects, and so they were really respectful or cautious of when they would go in there. And I wonder, you know, did you see that with the people that you studied with, like, you know, their use context? What was that like?
Yeah, well, that was definitely it. It was certainly not everybody's cup of tea, and it was not every Friday night. And it was when there was something very specific to look into. Actually, the Ashaninka people that I lived with were traditionally more tobacco oriented. And the word for shaman in their language, sheri piari, contains the word sheri, which is tobacco. You know, you have a question, you have a problem, your baby is ill or whatever it is, you go and see the tabaquero, and you know, long before anybody's going to drink any ayahuasca, they'll be smoking tobacco, blowing tobacco, eating tobacco, applying tobacco. It really is the number one shamanic and medicinal plant. And ayahuasca, it's been used in many ways by different people. I mean, you know, like to know where game might be, or to know when to go and attack your enemies, or finding a lost object, um, stuff like that. But even, you know, a hunter loses the capacity to shoot straight, and so this is like and is depressed. So it's like you go to the sort of Indian psychiatrist, and he wants to get you out of that funk you're in. Well, you know, to sort of reset the hunting brain. Um, well, ayahuasca is perfect for that. So there are like these pretty specific circumstances. Most of the time, it's to get knowledge about a situation. Um, you know, to understand where an illness came from, to understand what plant might help with that illness, etc. So that was, you know, not every village had an ayahuasca shaman. And then historically things had been changing. There had already been
Right.
missionaries, it had already been driven underground. So it was already a late 20th century situation.
And you bring up an interesting point in the book around maybe like the Western context, how it's turned into this like DMT centric narrative around ayahuasca, and how a lot of, I guess, neo shamanism type of containers, I think you said like contain 54% more DMT in their brews than traditional brews that are made. And yeah, just the importance of like possibly like vine only. You said that, yes, people use vine only ayahuasca to produce visions or dreams, right?
We'll see, like getting back to ways of knowing, if you're an average Westerner, without really even realizing it, you kind of subscribe to this idea of the active ingredient. So, what is the active ingredient of ayahuasca? Ah, it's DMT. Well, this is the scientific opinion that has been turned into a kind of orthodoxy. Um, but just talk to the indigenous Amazonian people, they'll tell you that the vine itself, which doesn't contain DMT, is the main ingredient. In fact, they make ayahuasca without DMT and without DMT containing plants, that the vine itself is somewhat visionary, but less spectacularly so when it doesn't have the DMT in it, but visionary nonetheless, and source of information, ideas, and knowledge. And the vine contains these beta-carboline molecules, harmaline, harmine, tetrahydroharmine, that have not been investigated that much, that are psychoactive and visionary to a certain extent, and that have been excluded by the DMT explains everything hypothesis. It is true that the DMT ayahuasca thing is a perfect explanation, because the beta-carbolines in the vines turn the DMT in the leaf into something that can get through the stomach. The beta-carbolines block the MAO inhibitors in the stomach. The DMT goes through into the blood and up to the brain. And so ayahuasca is a beautiful molecular fit between one plant that blocks the stomach enzyme and the other plant that contains the DMT, which becomes drinkable. Voila, it's ayahuasca is drinkable DMT. It all makes sense. The molecular fit is perfect. Well, problem is some ayahuascas don't have DMT in it, and the vine itself has these psychoactive elements that haven't really been studied. And actually the synergy, the Entourage Effect, between the harmine, harmaline, tetrahydroharmine, and other bioactive substances that are poorly studied, and their interaction with DMT haven't been looked at either. It turns out that harmine has all kinds of health-enhancing properties. It generates new neurons. It makes the immune system stronger. It's an antimicrobial. Anyway, these things are starting to be studied. But the whole thing is that people have fallen for this DMT explanation, whereas vine only is extremely interesting. It's more subtle, it's less fireworks, and it's extremely good for your health. And in some countries, it's legal, whereas the DMT part is not. So yeah, I think vine-only ayahuasca deserves further study. And it is psychoactive. This has been demonstrated by brain imagery studies down in Brazil, where ayahuasca is legal.
Are you aware of any studies going on vine only or harmine?
No, but I'd be happy if somebody could let me know. I mean, Eduardo Schenberg is this Brazilian neuroscientist, and he studied the neuroimagery, like the first neuroimagery of vine-only ayahuasca came out of his lab in 2015. I think at this point, there's a big emphasis on ayahuasca as an antidepressant, and that's what they're working on down in Brazil. Apparently, it has a pretty big potential. So there's so many things that remain open and not fully understood when it comes to ayahuasca. It's a complex cocktail, and the reductionism of the, like, say, oh, it's drinkable DMT, it is actually a misrepresentation. You know.
Yeah, it's good to know. This Entourage Effect conversation, it seems like there's only a few plants we know about it being the case. Ayahuasca, for one. Come on. Cannabis, CBD, THC for another.
Yeah.
I want to see data. I want to understand how we should think about things like cubensis mushrooms this way, but it's I've not been convinced yet, you know, like I've dug deep, but I haven't seen it.
In other words, you think that the entourage effect doesn't exist, is that right?
No. It's relevant in some plants, but perhaps there's other plants where it's not the case.
Okay. Well,
and
just one
fungi.
more. The reason also why it's doubly or even triply important for ayahuasca is that just the ayahuasca vine itself, if you make an extract from it, you already have a complex cocktail, and then that mixture is used to study all the other plants, and so it's a cocktail to which you can add tobacco and nicotine, datura and scopolamine, coca and cocaine. You can add any plant you want to study the effect of the plant. That's what ayahuasca also is. So it's at its base a cocktail, and then it can be turned into a psychoactive cocktail with many different plants, including DMT. So if you really wanted to understand ayahuasca, it would be necessary to have deep experience with vine only, which is already a cocktail, and look into how the different bioactive molecules in there interact. And then study vine only with different plants and not just the DMT. And then I think we could start going somewhere, but it's already extremely complex because it's cocktail city, basically.
Right. And science doesn't like to do more than one molecule for the most part, but we're getting there. Things are improving.
You know, actually, that's one of the friction points, which is that it's true that as soon as science starts getting serious, like, okay, ayahuasca has therapeutic potential, ayahuasca can maybe cure depression. All right, let's try to turn it into something marketable. All right, we need to standardize it. We need a standardized product. All right, so what is a standardized ayahuasca? It gets back to, it's like, what is a standardized cocktail? There is no standard cocktail. That's the whole point.
Right. It's quite diverse.
It's a contradiction in terms. So ayahuasca is it's like a wild horse. It's hard to bring it into the lab. It's hard to standardize. You know, it's hard even to put a harness on it. And when you do, then you have to drag it in. And I kind of like it that way. You know, I like those wild horses.
Makes it interesting.
Yeah, that's right. Keeps everybody on their toes.
Thinking about how, you know, complex the ayahuasca situation is, and let's do a quick comparison with LSD, because we kind of mentioned like there might be an opportunity to compare LSD and ayahuasca briefly. Could you kind of give us a little bit of a rundown from your perspective?
Yeah, I'd love to, because, you know, I put that question to Stan Groff. And so I actually had the privilege of interviewing Stan Groff once. And so I put that question to him. And he said that he had to admit that with ayahuasca, the experience was similar to meeting a person. Whereas with LSD, he didn't get that. So that it could be strong, there could be visions and so on, but there did not seem to be that other intelligence there with whom you were engaging or who was engaging you. I'm putting words into Stan's mouth, but it was 10 years ago, but that's what he said. And I agree with that. And I also agree with something that Terence McKenna once said, which was that he found LSD to be psychoanalytically grating. And that resonated with me. In other words, there can be times where you start thinking about your parents and stuff, and then it can be interesting, but it's not always easy. But with ayahuasca, it's more of you can go back into, you see yourself when you're younger, or see yourself from your children's eyes, or see your parents from a different perspective. You can, but it's less grating. And there is so it's a semi-synthetic LSD, and you can kind of feel it. That's I think that also by comparing ayahuasca to LSD is that that when you get into high dose territory where it becomes like something that resembles ayahuasca, there is a sort of a chemical impact that I feel, and that I think that it's easier at lower dose, and it's another animal. So, but then maybe low dose ayahuasca is interesting. I don't have much experience on that end. All this needs to be looked into, and I'm sure that dosage is important when it comes to LSD, cannabis for sure, and ayahuasca. The thing is that mainly what is practiced is that in most ayahuasca sessions they kind of do give you an effective dose. In other words, there's not much micro dosing of LSD going on that in ayahuasca circles that I know of.
I think I know of maybe only a couple people doing it total, and they're trying to make it a thing. They have interesting results, right? Like it's fascinating, and that harmaline kind of concept. I think there's something there.
So what are their results?
It seems in line with the standard reports for microdosing. Okay. Though they would probably have a lot more to say. I'm not super interested in microdosing overall, but I'm becoming more interested over time.
Yeah. It's called getting old, I think.
Yeah. I like it all ways, I guess, all the different ways, but it's it's an interesting topic, right? Like
for sure.
We keep getting stuff where it's like, oh, not that compelling, or maybe it is, but I'm excited for more data.
But I hadn't taken a sort of a strong dose of LSD for a long time, and then a couple years ago, I was in this garden here in Switzerland in early spring, and there was like an apple tree flowering, and we did it in the daytime, which is different from the ayahuasca, and it was an extremely strong experience, extremely moving and energizing, and it had analogous effects to a kind of an ayahuasca session in terms of really imprinting the beauty of nature on one. I was impressed, that good LSD in good circumstances, it can be good medicine.
Right. It's extraordinary. It's for me, it's not that scary. It's kind of a big step to even go into cubensis sometimes at healthy doses. Let's put it that way. And LSD seems less scary. Albert Hoffman had some line like, what was it, Kyle? Something along the lines
he
of
preferred
LSD and felt animated.
Yeah, there's something animate in the psilocybin experience, which can be overwhelming for some people, right? Like you're talking about that spirit that comes out. The mushrooms are telling me this. It's like, whoa, what is that? What's going on there?
I don't know, but I'm a friend of mushrooms, and mushrooms have been my friends. So I've been lucky that way. But I know that some people have been seriously freaked out by mushrooms.
Oh, totally. Yeah. It's, it's something about this animism concept that we haven't really wrestled with yet. I guess in general and also on this podcast, but when everything becomes alive or
I
subject.
Think in the case of mushrooms, it would be interesting to look into, but because people I've known several people who've been freaked out by mushroom experiences. They thought they were really fun, and then suddenly they took too strong a dose, and they got so extremely freaked out that they never took any again, and that's it. It would be interesting to look into what kind of people these are, just why that is, and then the friends of your friends are not necessarily your friends, or then you have this thing,
Right.
Dogs don't like everybody. And horses don't like everybody. Horses, I mean, my own brother, anytime he goes near a horse, they bite him. But just Does he give off fear? Just what is it? And I think the same with mushrooms is that sometimes, they just don't like people, and just why it is. This is something
You had
that
you had a paragraph on page 13. We brought this up in, we have an episode coming up for our 920 to talk about mushrooms. And I brought this up, and maybe it fits in here, but it was in your conversation with Raphael talking about tobacco, but it's in the Medicine and Malice chapter. And I'll just read this little quote here again, but I think it's interesting. I think this is Raphael speaking. Let's say that it's an activity for the spirits of the plants. Just as medicine is an activity and curing and healing brings satisfaction, for plants it's the same. Malice is an activity. They carry out on their own satisfaction. But for human beings, malice is painful, unsatisfactory, and difficult. The power of these plants can cause human losses. This is their mission, to teach us to practice their activities according to their line, to cause harm. Piercing the human body in a way that causes loss of life is an activity for them. And conversely, medicine is also an activity we develop to heal, to give life, and to make life longer. And this was, again, in relationship to tobacco. But, I read that and I thought about some of my past experiences, and I go, there are just some really terrifying experiences. Like, the mushrooms or something just wanted to show me this. I'm like, oh, what is going on here? That quote just really stood out for me reading your book. And I wonder how you interpret that. Have any thoughts about it?
Well, one thing that is striking is that in Amazonian thinking, the categories are less watertight than in Western thinking. In other words, good and the invisible entities with which shamans treat, they're morally ambiguous. They're good and bad. They can heal and harm. There's not that. I mean, they're powerful. And something powerful, they have power, they have knowledge, and this can be used one way or the other. It's like a chainsaw. It's good and bad, depending on how you use it. And for them and their way of thinking, this is already clear. But we tend to have more absolute oppositions, and so we think that good has nothing to do with bad, and healing has nothing to do with harm. And I think it's true that when dealing with these powerful plants, the indigenous way of thinking about it is probably closer to reality, and we have something there that needs meditating, and that is kind of difficult for our categories. That would be the short answer to your question.
Thank you.
So, but look, it's been a pleasure talking with you, gentlemen. But we could do another conversation further down the road.
Absolutely,
if you like.
Absolutely, it's been lovely. Really appreciate your time, and thanks for putting in all the hard work you have. I know it's been a labor of love.
All right. Well, it looks like you guys are doing a labor of love as well, and so thank you.
Absolutely, yeah, and. Jeremy Narby, thanks for being on the show, and hope we can do it again another time.
Yep, with pleasure.